Welcome back to Roots of Fear, where we uncover the darkest stories hidden in the shadows. Tonight, we venture into the mist-covered hills of rural Carolina, where the Winchester family's terrible secret still haunts the crumbling remains of their once grand estate. In the year 1889, when the war between the states had begun to fade from immediate memory, but remained etched in the landscape like an unhealed wound, the Winchester family stood as paragons of Southern recovery. Their sprawling plantation house, with its white columns rising like specters against the Carolina sky, had survived the conflict largely untouched, a fact that neighbors attributed to fortune, but locals whispered had darker origins. The Winchester estate sat perched upon a sloping hillside, surrounded by ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss that swayed like hanged men in the gentle southern breeze. The main house featured tall windows that gleamed in the sunlight, reflecting the carefully tended gardens and the distant blue haze of the Appalachian foothills. Those same windows, however, turned to obsidian mirrors after sunset, seemingly absorbing what little light the moon provided rather than reflecting it back. Inside the mansion, every room contained at least one mirror, an unusual preoccupation that visitors often remarked upon with nervous laughter. There were ornate standing mirrors with frames carved from mahogany harvested from the family's own lands, delicate hand mirrors with silver backs that showed tarnish despite the servants' best efforts, and even a collection of unusual curved mirrors imported from Venice at great expense. Each bedroom featured a vanity with a TPTIC of mirrors, allowing the occupant to view themselves from multiple angles. Simultaneously, the Winchester family themselves were as striking as their possessions. Patrician and bearing with pale complexions that seemed untouched by the Carolina sun. Augustus Winchester, the family patriarch, managed the business affairs with calculable precision. His wife, Constance, maintained the social standing of the family with ruthless dedication. Their three children, Edgar, Helena, and young Thomas, were the subject of much local speculation, primarily because they were so rarely seen beyond the estate grounds. It was Millicent Davis, a new housemaid hired in the autumn of 1889, who first noticed the peculiarity of the Winchester mirrors. While dusting the grand mirror in the main hallway, she caught a reflection that couldn't possibly have been her own. The figure moved when she stood still, its eyes tracking her with an intelligence that sent ice through her veins. When she turned naturally, no one stood behind her. That evening, as she described her experience to her sister in their shared cottage at the edge of town, Millicent couldn't shake the sensation that the figure in the mirror had resembled old Mr. K. Others, who had passed away the previous spring after selling a parcel of valuable timberland to Augustus Winchester for a fraction of its worth. What Millicent couldn't know then, what no one outside the Winchester family knew, was that their mirrors didn't reflect the viewer at all. They showed the faces of those whose misfortunes had built the Winchester fortune, whose suffering had elevated the family to prosperity, and whose silent accusations would eventually drive the Winchesters to their own particular madness. The Winchester mirrors possessed a chronology of their own, a hideous record of acquisition that began shortly after the war. Augustus had returned from the conflict, not with honor, but with a peculiar knowledge obtained from a dying Union soldier whose regiment had stumbled upon something ancient outside New Orleans. The soldier, delirious with fever, and clutching a leather-bound journal filled with strange geometric drawings, had whispered secrets in exchange for water from Augustus's canteen. These secrets, it seemed, concerned the capturing of souls through reflective surfaces. By the autumn of 1889, the Winchester collection had grown to precisely 43 mirrors, each obtained following a tragedy that somehow benefited the family. When the Elmwood orphanage burned to the ground, Augustus purchased the charred property for pennies on the dollar, discovering an untouched Chippendale mirror in the basement. 3 weeks after Widow Jenkins lost her battle with consumption, her brass hand mirror mysteriously appeared among Constance's possessions. The timing of these acquisitions formed a pattern too precise to be coincidental. The day following Millicent's unsettling discovery, a fierce storm descended upon the Carolina foothills. Rain lashed against the Winchester mansion's windows like desperate fingers seeking entry, while thunder rolled across the landscape in waves that seemed to emanate from the house itself rather than from the heavens. Such autumn tempests were not uncommon in the region, but old-timers in the nearby village of Craravans Mill noted that the lightning seemed concentrated above the Winchester estate, as if the weather itself were drawn to its spires. Inside, the household staff moved with increased trepidation. Polishing the mirrors, a daily task that consumed several hours, had become particularly dreaded. Servants reported glimpsing figures that shouldn't be there. The blacksmith's daughter who had drowned the previous spring after refusing young Edgar's advances. The elderly Confederate veteran who had disputed Augusta's property line before suffering an apoplectic fit at the county courthouse. A succession of faces both familiar and strange, all bearing expressions of silent accusation or muted terror. The Winchester had developed distinctive relationships with the mirrors. Edgar, the eldest at 22 years, spent hours examining his reflection with narcissistic intensity, though servants whispered that what he saw was not himself, but the countless young women who had caught his predatory eye. Helena, 20 summers old and unmarried despite her beauty, avoided the mirrors entirely, arranging her elaborate coiffure by touch alone, and employing her personal maid to ensure her appearance remained immaculate. Only Thomas, barely 13, seemed unaffected, frequently caught conversing with the mirrors as if the faces within were companions rather than captives. On the third day of the storm, as lightning transformed the afternoon into a grotesque panoply of day and night, Constance Winchester was observed by the cook's assistant standing before the Venetian mirror in the morning room, her lips moving in what appeared to be conversation. When the girl entered with tea, Constance's reflection shifted, momentarily displaying not the mistress's aristocratic features, but the weather-worn visage of a field hand who had disappeared from the neighboring property the previous winter. That night, as the storm reached its crescendo, Millicent found herself unable to sleep. The persistent tapping of rain against her window merged with another sound, a faint rhythmic scratching that seemed to emanate from within the walls of her modest quarters. Rising from her bed, she wrapped a woolen shawl around her nightdress and approached the small oval mirror hanging beside her wash basin. The glass appeared to ripple in the candlelight, its surface undulating like disturbed water. As Millicent drew closer, breath caught in her throat, the reflection clarified, not into her own visage, but into the face of a woman she recognized immediately as Eliza Hawthorne, the former governess, who had mysteriously vanished the previous winter after a heated argument with Constance Winchester. Eliza's spectral face was gaunt, her once vibrant eyes now hollow pools of accusation. Her lips moved wordlessly, desperately forming phrases Millicent strained to comprehend. Frozen between terror and fascination, Millicent found herself reaching toward the glass, her fingertips trembling as they approached the cold surface. "They trap us," came a whisper like dry leaves skittering across stone. Not our bodies, but something more essential. The following morning brought a temporary cessation of the rain, though lead clouds still hung low over the Winchester estate. Augustus, impeccably dressed in a charcoal waistcoat with silver threading that caught what little light filtered through the windows, summoned Millicent to his study, a somber chamber dominated by a mahogany desk and walls lined with leather-bound volumes whose spines had never been cracked. "You've been with us but a fortnight, Miss Davis," Augustus observed, his voice cultured yet cold as the underside of a stone. His fingers, unnaturally long and pale, tapped a precise rhythm against the polished wood. "Yet, I'm told you've taken a particular interest in our collection." Augustus Winchester possessed features that might have been considered handsome were they not arranged with such mathematical precision, his nose a perfect straight line, his eyes set Exactly the correct distance apart, his lips forming a symmetry that seemed almost artificial. Nothing about his appearance suggested warmth or humanity. Rather, he resembled something crafted to resemble a man without truly being one. "I merely attend to my duties, sir," Millicent replied, conscious of the perspiration gathering at her temples. Despite the room's chill. Indeed, his gaze never quite met hers, focusing instead on a point just beyond her shoulder. "Tonight, you will assist Helena with her evening preparations. She has expressed dissatisfaction with her current lady's maid." As twilight descended, Millicent made her way to Helena Winchester's chambers, treading carefully along corridors where shadows seemed to move independent of their sources. The young mistress's suite occupied the eastern wing, its windows overlooking the family cemetery, where generations of Winchesters lay beneath ornate marble markers. Helena sat at her vanity, back rigidly straight, eyes determinedly fixed on her lap rather than the tripartite mirror before her. Unlike her father's artificial perfection, Helena's beauty held a fragility that suggested imminent shattering. Porcelain pale skin, stretched taut over delicate bones, lips bloodlessly thin, and hair the color of straw gathered in an intricate arrangement that appeared to cause her physical pain. "You'll brush my hair 100 strokes," Helena instructed without turning, her voice carrying the brittle quality of ice forming over troubled water. "You will not speak unless spoken to, and under no circumstances are you to remark upon what you might see in the glass." As Millicent began the methodical brushing of Helena's flax and tresses, a peculiar transformation overcame the mirror before them. The glass darkened incrementally with each stroke of the brush, as though the fading daylight outside were being consumed by the reflective surface, rather than simply diminishing with the natural progression of evening. By the 50th stroke, the tripartite mirror had acquired the murky opacity of a stagnant pond. "They come to me in my dreams," Helena whispered. Suddenly, her voice barely audible above the persistent scratch of bristles against scalp. "The faces, they whisper, accusations I cannot refute." Millicent's hand faltered momentarily before resuming its rhythm. Within the deepening darkness of the mirror, shapes began to coalesce. Not Helena's delicate features, but the visages of three young women, their expressions frozen in identical masks of silent reproach. Their eyes, unnaturally wide and lament, with an inner light that had no earthly source, tracked every minute movement in the room. "Father says they chose their fate," Helena continued, her fingers plucking nervously at the lace trim of her dressing gown. "That in every transaction there is one who profits and one who pays. But I hear them weeping in the glass when the house sleeps." The central face in the mirror, belonging to a raven-haired girl no older than 16, parted bloodless lips to reveal teeth filed to unnatural points. No sound emerged, yet Millicent distinctly perceived the words forming in her mind. "She knows what was done to us." A distant grandfather clock tolled 9 times, its resonance oddly muffled as though the sound traveled through cotton wool. Outside Helena's window, the family cemetery appeared to undulate gently, white marble markers rising and falling like the chest of a slumbering beast. 73, Helena counted, though Millicent had long lost track of the brush strokes. "You must never stop before 100. Father says interruption weakens the binding." The temperature in the chamber plummeted precipitously. Millicent's breath emerged in crystalline clouds while frost patterns etched themselves across the window panes. Intricate geometries that mimicked the same strange symbols Millicent had glimpsed in Augustus Winchester's study carved into the edges of his desk. 89 Helena Ind. Mechanically, the mirror's surface began to weep, thin rivulets of viscous liquid that resembled mercury, but moved with deliberate purpose, tracing paths down the glass that formed letters before dissolving into nothingness. H-E-L-P-U-S. The brush in Millicent's hand suddenly acquired impossible weight, as though crafted from solid lead rather than polished cherry wood. Her arm trembled with the effort of continuing the appointed task. 97. Helena whispered, her voice now threaded with anticipation. 98-99. At the 100th stroke, the mirror emitted an audible sigh, a sound not of relief, but of capitulation. The 3 faces receded into the glass, replaced by Helena's reflection at last. Yet what appeared was not the Helena seated before the vanity, but rather a version of her with eyes hollowed into abyssal sockets, skin translucent enough to reveal the intricate lattice work of blue veins beneath and lips pulled into a rectus of silent screaming. The actual Helena rose from her seat with fluid grace that belied her apparent frailty. "You've done well," she said, turning to face Millicent for the first time. "Father will be pleased. Perhaps tonight you shall receive your own mirror." Morning arrived with a suffocating mist that coiled around the Winchester estate like spectral fingers. Millicent fled Helena's chambers without accepting the promised gift, her heart thundering against her ribs as she retreated to the servants' quarters. Sleep evaded her. Instead, she filled the remaining dark hours, transcribing everything she had witnessed into a small leather journal, borrowed from the kitchen maid. As pale light filtered through the windows, she made a decision. Armed with the pretense of retrieving linens from the East Wing storage room, Millicent slipped into the mansion's rarely visited 3rd floor. Here, dust gathered in undisturbed drifts along the baseboards, and the air carried the mineral tang of neglect. At the end of a narrow corridor stood a door unlike the others. Its wood darker, its hinges free from corrosion. No keyhole marred its surface, yet it remained firmly secured. As Millicent pressed her ear against the wood, muffled sounds emanated from within. The tinkling of glass, the soft murmur of voices in conversation, and beneath it all, a rhythmic scraping like nails against stone. "They sing when they believe themselves unobserved," came a voice behind her. Thomas Winchester stood at the corridor's end, his slight frame casting virtually no shadow, despite the morning light at his back. Unlike his siblings, the boy possessed a cherubic countenance, rosy cheeks, and golden curls that belied the unsettling emptiness in his gaze. "Young master," Millicent curtsied, attempting to mask her terror with deference. "I was merely seeking the linen cupboard. The mirrors." "Sing for me," Thomas continued as though she hadn't spoken. "Father says it's because I haven't yet chosen my reflection. The glass remembers me as I truly am." He approached with unhurried steps, trailing one pale finger along the wallpaper, leaving behind a faint phosphorescent trail that faded seconds after his passing. "Would you like to see where they're born? The mirrors, I mean. Father wouldn't approve, but his gone to town until sundown." Thomas's smile revealed teeth too small, too numerous for a child's mouth. "There's a workshop beneath the east garden. That's where the glass learns to hunger." Before Millicent could formulate a response, a tremendous crash echoed from the floor below. The unmistakable sound of shattering glass followed by an inhuman wail that clawed at the edges of sanity. Thomas's expression didn't change, but his eyes widened fractionally. "Someone's been freed," he whispered, excitement threading through his words. "How fascinating." Abandoning all pretense, Millicent raced downstairs toward the commotion. In the morning room, she found nothing but shards of the Venetian mirror scattered across the parquet floor like crystalline confetti. Each fragment reflected not the room's elegant furnishings, but microscopic portions of a single human face. An eye here, a portion of lip there, all belonging to the field hand she'd glimpsed in the glass the previous day. As she watched, transfixed with horror, the fragments began to move of their own accord, inching toward one another as though drawn by unseen magnetism. Constance Winchester's journal lay open on a nearby escatoire, its latest entry still glistening with wet ink. October 17th, 1889. The binding weakens with each passing day. Augustus insists the autumn equinox ritual will restore our control, but I fear we have accumulated more souls than even he can contain. The newest maid watches too closely. Perhaps she shall become 44. The autumn equinox arrived with an unnatural dawn. Not the gradual lightening of the eastern sky that Carolina mornings typically heralded, but a sudden illusion of daybreak that manifested while stars still punctured the heavens above. Millicent observed this phenomenon from the kitchen garden where she had retreated to gather her wits, clutching her borrowed journal like a talisman against the horrors of the Winchester estate. The scattered fragments of the Venetian mirror had been swept away before she could witness their complete coalescence, but the memory of those partial features attempting reunion haunted her. She had spent the intervening hours documenting everything, her handwriting growing increasingly erratic as she filled page after page with observations and suspicions. Distant voices drew her attention toward the east garden, the location of the workshop Thomas had mentioned. Through the morning mist, she discerned Augustus returning prematurely from town, his carriage wheels crunching gravel with foreboding precision. He was not alone. A rail-thin figure accompanied him, wrapped in a threadbare greatcoat, despite the mild temperature. Even from this distance, Millicent could see that the stranger moved with unnatural angularity, as if his joints functioned according to different anatomical principles than those governing ordinary men. The glass blower, whispered the cook's assistant, who had materialized beside Millicent. The girl's eyes were wide with fear, her lower lip trembling. He comes 3 times a year. After he leaves, someone always disappears. Millicent watched as Augustus led his guest toward an unassuming garden, shed partially obscured by carefully cultivated wisteria vines. The wooden structure appeared simultaneously ancient and new, weathered grey plank somehow maintaining perfect structural integrity. The door through which they entered seemed to absorb rather than reflect the morning light. "What happens in there?" Millicent asked, her voice barely audible. "The mirrors must be fed," the assistant replied cryptically before slipping back toward the kitchen, leaving Millicent alone with her mounting dread as the genuine sun finally crested the horizon. The estate underwent a subtle transformation. The windows of the main house, previously opaque with reflected mist, now gleamed with amber radiance that seemed too concentrated, too deliberate to be mere sunlight. Each pane appeared to focus this illumination inward, as if the Winchester mansion were not being lit by the sun, but rather consuming its essence. Compelled by a mingling of terror and determination, Millicent approached the east garden, circumnavigating the shed at a cautious distance. She discovered a narrow cellar window at ground level, partially concealed by ornamental grasses. Lowering herself to the damp earth, she peered into the darkness below. The workshop was a cathedral to perverted craftsmanship. A massive furnace dominated the space, its opening reminiscent of a monstrous M. The glass blower stood before it, his silhouette distorted by the rippling heat. Augustus Winchester circled a long workbench upon which lay dozens of silver-backed hand mirrors arranged in a precise geometric pattern that made Millicent's eyes water when she attempted to discern its logic. Most disturbing, however, were the walls. What Millicent had initially taken for hanging tools were in fact human forms, or something approximating human forms, suspended against the stone. They writhed with glacial slowness, their features fluid and indistinct, as if struggling to maintain coherent identities. Occasionally, one would emit a keening vibration that sent ripples through the very air of the workshop. The glass blower approached the furnace with a long metal rod. As he thrust it into the molten heart of the fire, Augustus began to inone words in no language Millicent recognized. The suspended forms grew more agitated, their movements more desperate, as a viscous substance that was neither glass nor liquid merged with the molten material at the rod's end. Millicent understood then with horrifying clarity. The Winchester mirrors were not merely possessed by trapped souls. They were fabricated from them. The final pieces of Millicent's desperate investigation fell into place when she discovered a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard in her quarters. Within lay a collection of yellowed newspaper clippings from the Cravens Mill Gazette. Dating back to the end of the war, the earliest dated May 6, 1865. Bore a headline that sent ice through her veins. Peculiar glass works discovered an abandoned Union camp. The article detailed how Confederate soldiers returning home had stumbled upon a deserted Union encampment outside New Orleans, where they discovered curious apparatus for glassmaking of an unusual character and journals containing blasphemous formulae related to the ancient Egyptian belief in capturing the Ca or soul essence within reflective surfaces. Most disturbingly, the article mentioned that several unidentifiable remains were found calcified in a state, suggesting they had been subjected to temperatures far exceeding conventional glass making processes. Further clippings documented Augustus Winchester's seemingly inexplicable rise to prominence after returning from the war with certain artifacts salvaged from abandoned enemy territories. His acquisition of neighboring properties coincided with a troubling pattern of disappearances and premature deaths throughout the county. Most revealing was an architectural notice from 1873 announcing Winchester's commissioning of extensive subterranean modifications to the east garden structures requiring specialized ventilation suitable for metallurgical and vitrification processes. As twilight approached on the day of the equinox, the Winchester mansion throbbed with palpable anticipation. Servants skewered through corridors with downcast eyes, delivering covered trays to family members who had sequestered themselves in their respective chambers. The mirrors throughout the house seemed to darken collectively, their surfaces developing a peculiar opacity, like skin forming over cooling broth. From the kitchen, Millicent observed Helena Winchester crossing the rear courtyard toward the workshop, carrying what appeared to be a small bird cage draped with black velvet. The young woman moved with the deliberate precision of a sleepwalker, her normally rigid posture now fluid with purpose. The estate's ancient groundskeeper, a man who had survived 3 generations of Winchester patriarchs, approached Millicent as she watched through the window. "They'll be wanting everyone accounted for by sundown," he murmured, his rheumy eyes never meeting hers. "The equinox ritual requires symmetry. 43 vessels and 43 subjects. Been that way since the master brought back the Venetian technique." His gnarled fingers trembled as he pressed a small object into Miles's palm. A circular mirror no larger than a lady's compact. Its tarnished silver backing engraved with Egyptian hieroglyphs. "This one doesn't take," he whispered. "It reflects true." Old Mr. Winchester, Augusta's father, commissioned it as protection against what his son was becoming. "Look into it when they summon you, and you'll see them as they truly are." As darkness claimed the Carolina hills, bells throughout the mansion began to toll. Not the familiar chiming of clocks marking the hour, but a discordant cacophony emanating from every mirror in the house, vibrating with voices not meant for human ears, calling the household to witness the feeding of the glass. The groundskeeper's warning still reverberating in her ears. Millicent clutched the small protective mirror as the discordant tolling intensified. The sound penetrated bone and tissue, vibrating through her chest cavity with such resonance that she feared her ribs might shatter. Throughout the mansion, gas lamps dimmed in unison, their flames shrinking to ghostly blue pinpricks that cast more shadow than illumination. A procession had begun. From her vantage point near the servants' stairwell, Millicent observed the household staff moving toward the east garden in perfect synchronicity, their faces utterly devoid of expression. Even Mrs. Holloway, the perpetually fretful head housekeeper, moved with the mechanical precision of a clockwork automaton. Her normally animated features frozen in placid acceptance. The 43 Millicent whispered to herself, counting the procession, 26 house servants, the groundskeeper himself, who had vanished. After delivering his warning, for stable hands, 3 gardeners, and 9 others whose functions within the household had always remained ambiguous. Each carried a silver candelabrum bearing 13 unlit candles, the waxen unnatural shade of pearlescent grey. The family emerged last. Augustus, Constance, Edgar, Helena, and Thomas, walking in formation with their arms extended at identical angles, fingertips precisely the same distance from the floor. They no longer moved like humans at all, but rather like marionettes manipulated by unseen strings from above. Most disturbing was their synchronous breathing, 5 chests rising and falling in perfect unison, as though they shared a single set of lungs. Millicent hesitated at the threshold between safety and revelation. The protective mirror grew warm against her palm, pulsating with gentle resistance to the terrible harmonics now building throughout the estate. Outside, the twilight sky had acquired a sickly amber cast. Clouds transforming into elongated streaks that converge directly above the workshop like spokes on a wheel. The girl is missing. Edgar. Winchester's voice rang out with unnatural resonance. Though he stood nearly 50 yards away, his words reached Millicent with the clarity of a whisper directly into her ear. Number 44 is unaccounted for. She will come. Augustus replied with serene confidence. The glass calls to all who gaze upon it with seeking eyes. She cannot resist its summons, as if in response, Millicent felt an inexorable tug toward the procession, not a physical pulling, but rather an erosion of her very will to resist. The protective mirror grew hotter, developing a network of hairline fractures across its surface as it countered the compulsion. The workshop door stood open now, emitting a column of iridescent light that bore no relation to the furnace glow Millicent had observed earlier. Within this radiance, the silhouette of the glass blower moved in contorted patterns, his proportions shifting between one moment and the next, sometimes impossibly elongated, sometimes compressed into a dense knot of impossible angles. 43 vessels require 43 subjects, Thomas Winchester intoned, his childish voice layered with deeper, older voices speaking in unison. But the 44th mirror requires special handling, a vessel aware of its purpose, a subject who has witnessed the transformation. The groundskeeper's protective mirror split completely in Millicent's hand, slicing her palm. As her blood touched the fractured silver backing, the hieroglyphs began to glow with an inner radiance that pushed back against the workshop's sickly illumination. 2. Ancient magics meeting in silent combat as the Winchester ritual reached its culmination. The old grandfather clock in the hallway tolled midnight, each hollow boom reverberating through the Winchester mansion like a funeral bell. Outside, the amber twilight had deepened into something beyond mere darkness. A void that seemed to consume rather than merely obscure, pressing against the windows with palpable weight. The equinox ritual had reached its zenith. Millicent's blood traced elaborate patterns through the fractured hieroglyphs, forming channels that glowed with a silvery luminescence distinctly different from the sickly green emanations of the workshop. Ancient protections awakened, pushing outward against the Winchester family's borrowed magic. For a brief crystalline moment, the compulsion drawing her toward the procession faltered. In that moment of clarity, she witnessed the true nature of the gathering. The Winchester family stood at 5 points around the workshop entrance, forming a perfect pentagram. But their forms had begun to shift, their carefully maintained human facade slipping like ill-fitted masks. Augustus's face elongated unnaturally, the skin stretched taut across a skull structure that bore little resemblance to anything born of woman. Constance's carefully coiffed hair now moved independently of the evening breeze, coiling and uncoiling like nests of liquid shadow. The children's transformations were subtler, but perhaps more disturbing, their features remaining recognizably human, while something fundamentally alien gazed out from behind their eyes. The servants had arranged themselves in concentric circles around the family, each holding their candelabra at precisely the same height. As Millicent watched, the procession began a slow rotation, moving clockwise while the Winchesters turned counterclockwise, creating opposing currents of energy that manifested as visible distortions in the air between them. The symmetry falters, the glass blower called from within the workshop, his voice containing impossible harmonics that caused several nearby window panes to develop spiral fractures. The 44th vessel remains unfilled. Without completion, all will be undone. A tremor passed through the earth beneath Millicent's feet, subtle at first, but rapidly intensifying. Throughout the mansion, mirrors began to fracture, hairline cracks spreading across reflective surfaces with the deliberate precision of frost patterns. From within each broken glass, a chorus of muffled voices rose in discord and joy. "They're escaping," Elena shrieked, her voice modulating between her own refined soprano and something ancient and rasping. "Father, the bindings weaken." Augustus Winchester raised arms that now seemed jointed in too many places, his fingers elongating into translucent appendages that caught and refracted the workshop's iridescent light. "The ritual cannot be interrupted," he intoned. "Bring the 44th subject, or all we have harvested will be lost." The protective mirror in Millicent's bleeding hand suddenly cooled, the fractured pieces realigning themselves with an audible click. Within its restored surface, she glimpsed not her own reflection, but the face of the groundskeeper. Older now, his eyes filled with a terrible wisdom. "Return them to the light," his image whispered. "Break the 43, and the vessels shall release what they have wrongfully contained." With the groundskeeper's face fading from the protective mirror, Millicent felt a surge of resolve crystallize within her breast. The Winchester ritual continued its dreadful progression outside, but throughout the mansion, the fractured mirrors called to her, their chorus of trapped souls rising to a desperate crescendo that only she could hear. Gathering her skirts, she raced through the East Wing corridor, where the largest collection of mirrors hung in oppressive abundance. Each reflective surface now displayed spiderweb fractures behind which pressed faces contorted in silent supplication. Millicent recognized several. The blacksmith's daughter, Widow Jenkins, old Mr. Curthus, while others remained strangers, their features distorted by decades of captivity within the silvered glass. "Return them to the light," she whispered, the groundskeepers' instruction burning in her mind. The mansion trembled again, more violently this time. From the garden came Augustus Winchester's voice, no longer entirely human, chanting phrases in that terrible language that made the air itself recoil. Millicent knew with dreadful certainty that she had precious little time before they would come for her. The 44th subject, the final piece in their abominable symmetry. In the grand hallway, hung the oldest of the Winchester mirrors, a massive oval in a frame of blackened oak, its surface rippling like disturbed water. This was where it had begun. She realized the first vessel containing the first soul Augustus had harvested upon his return from the war. Without hesitation, Millicent seized a brass fireplace poker from its stand and swung it with all her strength at the glass. The impact reverberated through her arms like a lightning strike, but the mirror's surface held firm, developing only a single additional crack that ran precisely down its center. "They cannot be broken by conventional means," came Thomas Winchester's voice behind her. The boy stood at the corridor's end, his childish form now terribly elongated, neck stretched to an impossible length, while his eyes had receded into cavernous sockets. "The vessels are bound by blood and intention." Millicent backed away, still clutching the poker. "What are you?" she demanded, her voice steadier than she felt. "We are the custodians," Thomas replied, his voice layering atop itself in echoing patterns. "Before your kind built Cities, we collected experiences. We preserved moments of perfect emotion, fear, despair, revelation, but we could not maintain physical form without vessels to contain what we harvested. He gestured toward the fractured mirrors lining the hall. Father discovered the method in New Orleans. Glass infused with essence. Mirrors that capture rather than reflect. Each subject provides sustenance for decades. As Thomas spoke, Millicent felt the protective mirror pulse against her wounded palm. Her blood had formed intricate patterns across its silver backing. Hieroglyphs now glowing with increasing intensity. Understanding bloomed within her mind with terrible clarity. Blood and intention, she whispered. Without warning, she pressed her bleeding palm against the grand hallway mirror. The effect was instantaneous. The glass shuddered beneath her touch, its surface liquefying like mercury. From within its depths emerged a blinding pillar of light that coalesced into the form of a Union soldier. His uniform tattered, but his eyes clear with newfound freedom. Thomas screamed, a sound no human throat could produce, as throughout the mansion mirrors began to dissolve, releasing their captives in brilliant displays of luminescence that pushed back the unnatural darkness of the equinox night. As dawn broke across the Carolina hills, the Winchester estate stood transformed. The once proud mansion now appeared desiccated. Its white columns grayed and crumbling as though decades of decay had been compressed into a single night. Windows that had gleamed with unnatural luster now gaped like hollow eye sockets. Their glass entirely vanished. The carefully manicured gardens had withered into twisted arrangements of blackened vegetation that bore little resemblance to their former splendor. Millicent stood amid the devastation. The protective mirror, now restored to pristine condition, clutched in her trembling hand. Around her, the materialized forms of the mirrors. Captives were gradually dissolving into mist as the rising sun touched their ephemeral bodies, their expressions conveying profound gratitude as they dissipated into the morning air. The Union soldier had been the last to depart, pressing into Millicent's hands a weather-beaten journal that had somehow manifested alongside his spectral form. The leather-bound volume carried the unmistakable odor of grave soil and chemical preservatives. Its pages, brittle yet intact. The custodians must never return, he had whispered before fading into nothingness. The knowledge must be preserved that others might recognize the signs. With the immediate danger past, Millicent retreated to the village of Craravans Mill, seeking sanctuary in the modest parish church, where she now sat among empty pews, carefully examining the soldier's journal. Its pages revealed the terrible truth behind the Winchester family's unnatural existence. The journal began with an entry dated April 19, 1865. We have discovered something beneath the Louisiana bayou that defies Christian understanding. The locals call it linger. Kimage, the mirror that eats. Confederate deserters had been using the cave as refuge, but what we found inside were not men, but husks, their eyes replaced with reflective surfaces, their mouths frozen in silent screams. Lieutenant Carrington believes the artifacts date to ancient Egyptian settlement that Professor Olmsted theorized existed in this region. The hieroglyphs match those documented in Olmsted's controversial monograph on transatlantic contact. Most disturbing are the writings we found carved into the cave walls, instructions for binding non-human intelligences to our reality through the creation of specialized reflective surfaces. Subsequent entries detailed the Union regiment's disastrous attempts to destroy the artifacts, resulting in the possession of several soldiers by entities they came to know as the custodians, ancient consciousnesses that existed beyond physical form, requiring human vessels to maintain presence in the material world. The final pages contained precise diagrams of the countermeasure mirror that had saved Millicent, a protective device designed by an Egyptian priest to reflect the true nature of the custodians rather than capture souls as their perverted creations did. As Millicent closed the journal. The parish door creaked open. The elderly vicar entered, his face grave as he approached. "There is something you must see," he said softly, leading her to the churchyard. There, freshly carved into the side of an ancient limestone mausoleum, was a familiar symbol. The geometric pattern she had observed in Augustus Winchester's study. Beneath it, words had been etched into the stone with meticulous precision. The 44th vessel awaits. We are patient. We are eternal. The village of Craravans Mill transformed in the weeks following the Winchester catastrophe. What had been whispers behind closed doors became open speculation in the town square. The general store, the barber shop. The protective mirror remained in Millicent's possession, wrapped in a square of black velvet and secreted beneath the floorboards of her sister's cottage where they had taken refuge. Autumn deepened around them. The maples along the village green surrendered their leaves to increasingly bitter winds that seemed to carry whispered voices from the direction of the Winchester estate. Farmers reported livestock found staring transfixed at puddles of rainwater, refusing to move until physically dragged away. Children returned from play with stories of seeing strangers' faces in window panes and polished door knobs. On the first frost of November, Millicent awoke to find her breath forming unnatural patterns in the air above her bed. Not the expected cloudy exhalations, but precise geometric shapes that hung suspended before dissipating. The protective mirror pulsed beneath the floor with gentle warning. She retrieved it with trembling fingers, its surface warmer than the surrounding air. "They're seeking another way in," she whispered to her reflection, her actual reflection. The mirror still functioning as the groundskeeper had promised. The Union soldier's journal had been clear. The custodians existed outside conventional physical constraints, their consciousness flowing like water to find any available vessel. The Winchesters had merely been the most recent in a lineage of human collaborators, stretching back to antiquity, offering their mirrors as portals between realms in exchange for unnatural longevity and influence. That morning, Millicent ventured into town for provisions, the mirror secured in a pocket sewn into her petticoat. The square was unusually crowded for such a bitter day. At the center stood a wagon painted midnight blue, its sides adorned with gilded astrological symbols, a banner proclaimed in elaborate script: Professor Thaddeus Blackwell's traveling exhibition of optical wonders and photographic curiosities. The spectacle had drawn most of Craravans Mill's 500 residents. Children pressed eagerly forward while adults maintained a veneer of sophisticated disinterest that couldn't quite mask their fascination. Atop the wagon stood a man of indeterminate age, his tailored charcoal suit immaculate despite the dusty surroundings. His face, clean-shaven and handsome in a mathematically perfect way, struck Millicent with horrifying familiarity. "Distinguished citizens," the man announced, his cultured voice carrying effortlessly across the square. "I bring you marvels of modern science. An ancient mystery, photographic plates that capture not merely your visage, but perhaps something more essential." The crowd murmured appreciatively as Blackwell gestured toward black velvet curtains concealing the wagon's interior. "For a modest consideration, you may experience the wonder of self-reflection through my specially crafted lenses imported at great expense from Venetian craftsmen whose techniques date back to the 15th century. As the crowd pressed closer, Blackwell's gaze swept across their upturned faces, pausing fractionally upon discovering Millicent at the periphery. Though his expression remained pleasantly neutral, something ancient and hungry flickered behind his eyes. The protective mirror against Millicent's hip grew painfully hot, as Blackwell's lips curved into a smile of precise familiar symmetry. The village church bells tolled 3 o'clock, each resonant peal hanging in the frost-laden air with unnatural persistence. Millicent stood transfixed at the edge of the town square, her fingers pressing the protective mirror through layers of fabric, as though its mere proximity might shield her from Professor Blackwell's penetrating gaze. The crowd's excited murmurings took on a rhythmic quality, rising and falling like the breathing of some vast collective organism, unwittingly synchronizing as they pressed closer to the midnight blue wagon. "Step forward, good people," Blackwell called, his precise diction slicing through the bitter November air. "Who shall be first to witness themselves as they truly are?" The protective mirror pulsated against Millicent's hip with increasing urgency, its heat now penetrating through petticoat and dress alike. Above the square, birds wheeled in disquing patterns, not the chaotic scattering typical of crows or starings, but deliberate geometric formations that seemed to mirror the symbols adorning Blackwell's wagon. The shadows cast by these aerial maneuvers slid across the gathered villagers like calculating fingers. Mayor Thornfield's daughter, a willowy girl of 17, with amber curls cascading beneath her bonnet, stepped forward with the impetuous confidence of privileged youth. As she ascended the 3 wooden steps to the wagon's platform, Millicent observed how the air around her shimmered almost imperceptibly, a distortion reminiscent of heat rising from summer-baked cobblestones, yet entirely incongruous in the November chill. "Ah, an admirable volunteer," Blackwell purred, producing white gloves from his waistcoat pocket and drawing them on with meticulous care. "Your name, my dear?" "Constance Thornfield," the girl replied, her voice carrying the practiced refinement of finishing school elocution lessons. A tremor passed through Millicent at the name. Constance, like the Winchester matriarch, whose unnatural grace had presided over 43 captured souls. The coincidence pressed against her consciousness with suffocating weight. Behind the wagon, the afternoon sun slipped behind gathering clouds, plunging the square into premature twilight. Lanterns along the storefronts ignited spontaneously, their flames and unnerving shade of blue-white that cast stark elongated shadows across the cobblestones. These silhouettes moved with subtle discrepancies from their owners' movements, turning their heads a moment before the actual villagers did. Raising hands that their flesh and blood counterparts kept still, Blackwell drew back the velvet curtain with theatrical flourish, revealing an interior draped entirely in obsidian silk. At its center stood an apparatus combining elements of camera and mirror, brass fittings gleaming with unnatural luster, lenses ground to impossible precision. The device rested upon a tripod carved with hieroglyphics identical to those Millicent had seen in Augustus Winchester's study. "Behold," Blackwell announced, "the reflective chronicler," capturing not merely light's momentary dance upon features, but the very essence of its subject. As young Constance positioned herself before the device, Millicent perceived how the gathered crowd's breathing had synchronized completely, their collective exhalation forming elaborate frost patterns in the air that coalesced into the now familiar geometric symbol, a pentagon within a circle, bisected by precisely aligned lines that formed an unblinking eye at its center. The protective mirror now burned against Millicent's flesh with such intensity that she bit her lip to prevent crying out. In that moment of pain-induced clarity, she realized with mounting horror that Professor Thaddeus Blackwell's gloved hands possessed exactly the same number of joints as Augustus Winchester's had during the failed equinox ritual. Too many and all bending in directions that human anatomy could not accommodate. Frost-rimmed winds coursed through Craravans Millers. Millicent pushed through the transfixed crowd, her hand clutched to the burning mirror at her side. The synchronous breathing of the villagers had transformed into a low collective hum that vibrated through her very marrow. Young Constance Thornfield now sat rigid before Blackwell's apparatus, her previously animated features slack with unnatural stillness as the professor adjusted brass dials with his many-jointed fingers. "Remarkable cooperation," Blackwell murmured, though his voice carried to every ear in the square with perfect clarity. The previous settlement required considerably more persuasion. The realization struck Millicent with terrible force. Craravans Mill was not his first target since the Winchester failure. Other communities had already fallen to his collection efforts. The protective mirror's heat intensified to an almost unbearable degree. Its ancient magic recognizing the immediate threat that hovered over the assembled townsfolk. "Observe," Blackwell announced, addressing the mesmerized audience while positioning a silver-backed photographic plate within his device. "How the subject's essence transfers itself willingly to the prepared medium." A mechanism within the apparatus emitted a grinding sound, gears turning with the precision of clockwork, but the resonance of something far older than Victorian engineering. The lenses aligned themselves without human assistance, focusing with predatory intent upon young Constance's unblinking visage. Behind the contraption, a reservoir of quicksilver bubbled with unnatural vivacity. Despite the November chill, the Union Soldier's Journal had described this exact process. The preparation of a capturing medium through the infusion of mercury with certain botanical extracts harvested exclusively during celestial alignments. The custodians had refined their techniques since ancient Egypt, adapting to contemporary technology while maintaining their fundamental hunger for human essence. "The 44th vessel requires special handling," Blackwell continued, echoing Thomas Winchester's words with such precision that Millicent felt ice crystallize along her spine. "A witness who comprehends the transformation becomes the perfect conduit." His gaze found her again, penetrating through the crowd with terrible recognition. Around him the air distorted perceptibly, reality itself seeming to thin where his form intersected with the material world. For a fleeting moment, Millicent glimpsed what lay beneath his immaculate human guise, a writhing architecture of angles that human minds were not designed to comprehend. The protective mirror burned through fabric now, searing her flesh with purifying fire. Acting on instinct rather than calculation, Millicent withdrew it from her pocket and held it aloft, its unblemished surface catching the unnatural blue-white light of the square's lanterns. "Behold your true reflection," she cried, her voice breaking through the hypnotic hum that had entrapped her neighbors. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Blackwell's carefully constructed glamour faltered as the mirror reflected not his handsome human countenance but his actual form. A shifting constellation of impossible geometries tethered tenuously to three-dimensional space. The villagers' synchronized breathing fractured into gasps and cries of revulsion. Most terrifying was the reaction of Blackwell's apparatus itself. The lenses cracked in perfect spirals, mercury boiling upward against gravity's constraints, while the photographic plate shattered into precisely 43 fragments. Each shard contained not portions of Constance Thornfield's interrupted portrait, but faces Millicent recognized from the Winchester mirrors, souls already captured, connecting across time and space to this new attempt at harvesting. The sky above Craven's Mill darkened to an unnatural indigo as Blackwell's true form writhed against the constraints of human perception. The fragmented shards of his apparatus spun through the air like malevolent snowflakes, each reflecting a different imprisoned soul. Young Constance Thornfield slumped forward on her chair, her consciousness momentarily suspended between capture and liberation. Villagers scattered across the square in panicked disarray, their synchronized breathing now replaced by discordant screams that echoed against the brick facades of the surrounding buildings. Several collapsed where they stood, overwhelmed by glimpses of reality their minds could not accommodate. Those who maintained consciousness fled toward the church, the schoolhouse, anywhere that might offer sanctuary from the horror unfolding before them. "Foolish vessel!" Blackwell's voice resonated from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, the words forming in the air like frost patterns on winter glass. "The custodians are not so easily banished. We have waited epochs before. We shall simply begin again." The mercury from his shattered apparatus coalesced into quick rivulets that slithered across the cobblestones with deliberate purpose, seeking reflective surfaces, window panes, rain barrels, even the polished Buttons on the mayor's waistcoat. Wherever the silver substance touched, glass darkened and metal tarnished. Preparing new vessels for occupation. Millicent stood her ground. The protective mirror held before her like an ancient shield. Its surface now emitted a silvery radiance that pushed back against the encroaching darkness, creating a sphere of clarity amid the chaos. The hieroglyphs etched into its backing pulsed with increasing urgency. Ancient magic awakening to contemporary threat. The 44th vessel was never meant for me, she realized aloud, her voice steady despite the tempest of unreality surrounding her. It was meant for you to reflect your essence back upon itself. The distorted form that had been Professor Blackwell contorted in what might have been rage or recognition. The midnight blue wagon began to fold inward along impossible angles, its structure collapsing into dimensions beyond human comprehension. Above the square, the birds had resumed their geometric formations, now arranging themselves into a slowly rotating spiral that mirrored the pattern forming in the cobblestones beneath. From the church tower, bells began to toll without human intervention. Not the measured marking of hours, but an arrhythmic clanging that nonetheless formed a counterpoint to the unfolding horror. Each peal momentarily solidified reality, pushing back against the thinning boundaries between worlds that Blackwell's manifestation had weakened. The protective mirror grew weightless in Millicent's grasp, hovering of its own accord before her outstretched hands. Its surface rippled like disturbed water. The hieroglyphs along its edge now glowing with such intensity that they projected their shapes onto the surrounding buildings. These ancient symbols of protection cascaded across brick and timber, enclosing the square within a geometrically perfect boundary that the quicksilver could not cross. Your mirror's capture, Millicent addressed the writhing horror before her, understanding flowering within her mind with terrible clarity. This one reflects what you would take from others. Returns to you thousandfold. As she spoke these words, the protective mirror expanded, its circumference growing, until it hovered above the square like a silver moon within its immaculate surface. Not just Blackwell, but all the custodians were suddenly visible. Ancient consciousnesses intertwined across time and space. Their collective hunger exposed to the purifying light of true reflection. The protective mirror trembled above Craven's mill like a silver sun. Its ancient magic fully awakened, reflected in its flawless surface. The custodian's true form became manifest. A vast writhing architecture of consciousness that existed beyond temporal constraints. Their collective entity resembling nothing so much as an immense crystalline lattice composed of stolen moments and captured emotions. Within this impossible geometry, individual fragments of human suffering pulsed like trapped fireflies. The blacksmith's daughter, Widow Jenkins. Countless others whose essence had fed these ancient parasites across centuries. Each soul a small flame of humanity preserved in perfect eternal agony. The symmetry completes itself in toned a voice that emanated not from Blackwell's dissolving form, but from the very air itself. The remaining mercury droplets vibrated in perfect harmony with these words, forming momentary reflective surfaces that instantly froze into fractal patterns upon the cobblestones. Millicent stood unwavering at the center of the maelstrom. Her consciousness expanded beyond normal perception by contact with the protective mirror. Through its ancient magic, she perceived the truth that the custodians' weakness lay in their fundamental nature as collectors, rather than creators. You have never truly existed, she pronounced, each syllable resonating with the church bell's continuing clamor. You are merely an absence that must be filled with stolen light. The immense reflection shuddered, ripples of distortion passing across its surface, like winds over a silver sea. From within its depths came a sound, both ancient and terrible. The collective wail of entities that had never known want suddenly confronted with their own fundamental emptiness. We have witnessed The birth of stars, they protested in unison, their voices cascading through octaves impossible for human vocal cords. We have tasted the fear of the first creatures to know death. Yet you yourselves have created nothing, Mealy's countered, the protective mirror responding to her understanding, its surface becoming increasingly reflective until it approached perfect recursion. You are vessels without essence. Above the town, clouds parted to reveal a cold November moon. Its natural light interacting with the protective mirror to create a resonance that vibrated through the very foundations of Craven's mill. Windows shattered in perfect silence, the fragments hovering momentarily in midair before dissolving into diamond dust that sparkled like stars fallen to earth. The custodian's collected consciousness contracted upon itself in desperate self-preservation, abandoning Blackwell's form entirely. His human disguise collapsed like empty clothing, the midnight blue wagon folding inward until nothing remained but a precise geometric shadow burnt into the cobblestones. Villagers who had taken refuge in doorways and alleyways witnessed the impossible sight of reality folding back upon itself. The protective mirror, creating an infinitely recursive loop that forced the custodians to confront not the stolen fragments of humanity they had collected, but the fundamental emptiness at their core. What cannot face its own reflection, Millicent whispered, understanding flowering within her with terrible finality, cannot maintain existence within our reality. The protective mirror contracted suddenly, its impossible expanse collapsing into a perfect singularity of reflection. For one breathless moment, every surface in Craven's mill, from puddles to window panes, displayed not the objects before them, but the custodian's true form, caught in an eternal moment of recognition and dissolution. In the weeks that followed, Craven's mill emerged from its collective nightmare like a convalescent from fevered dreams. Windows previously animated by unnatural reflections now simply showed honest daylight, or the gentle glow of properly behaved lamps. The square where Professor Blackwell's midnight blue wagon had stood remained strangely barren. No grass would grow upon the perfect geometric shadow burned into the cobblestones, and even during rainstorms, water flowed around rather than across the scorched pattern. The protective mirror, having fulfilled its ancient purpose, had contracted to its original size before falling into Millicent's outstretched hands, its surface now bearing a web of silver fractures like frozen lightning. Though damaged beyond repair, she kept it wrapped in black velvet beneath the floorboards of her sister's cottage, occasionally removing it during the darkest hours of night to confirm it reflected nothing but her own honest visage. Young Constance Thornfield recovered from her encounter with remarkable resilience. Though her amber curls now featured a single streak of silver that no dye could disguise, she retained no conscious memory of her time suspended between capture and liberation. Yet her dreams were reportedly filled with voices speaking in languages long forgotten to human scholarship. Throughout the surrounding countryside, those who had possessed Winchester mirrors reported waking to find their prized possessions transformed to ordinary glass, still reflective but incapable of capturing anything beyond superficial appearance. Several prominent families discreetly removed such items from their parlors. Suddenly uncomfortable with their providence, the Union Soldier's Journal remained in Millicent's possession, its brittle pages now supplemented with her meticulous documentation of the Craven's Mill incident. She had taken to studying Egyptian hieroglyphics under the tutelage of the parish vicar, whose extensive library surprisingly contained several obscure volumes on ancient protective symbols. Together they translated the mysterious inscription that had appeared on the protective mirror's silver back following the confrontation. A warning that though banished, the custodians remained eternal, merely waiting beyond the thin membrane of reality for human weakness to provide another entry point. Winter descended upon Carolina with unusual severity that year. Ponds froze to unprecedented depths, their surfaces utterly opaque rather than reflective. Villagers noted how stars seemed dimmer in the night sky as though celestial. Light struggled to penetrate the atmosphere above their town. Children born in the months following the incident reportedly did not recognize their reflections until well past the age when such self-awareness typically develops. Millicent herself found employment as governess to the Thornfield household, where she kept careful watch over young Constance and instructed her charges never to stare over long into reflective surfaces. On her modest salary, she commissioned a small granite marker placed in Craravans Mill Cemetery, bearing only the inscription, "To the 43, return to light." No names were necessary. The intended recipients of this memorial existed beyond conventional remembrance. The Winchester estate remained abandoned, nature gradually reclaiming its grounds with unusual vigor. Explorers brave enough to venture near the decrepit mansion reported that not a single reflective surface remained intact within its collapsing walls. As though the very concept of reflection had been banished from its domain, a peculiar occurrence manifested as winter released its grip on Craravans Mill. The emergence of a pattern in the surrounding landscape, visible only from elevated perspectives. From the church bell tower, one could discern how certain trees had withered in perfect arcs, while others flourished with unnatural vigor, together forming concentric rings expanding outward from the scorched cobblestones of the town square. These botanical hieroglyphs, as the Vicar termed them, corresponded with symbols found in the final pages of the Union Soldier's Journal. The protective mirror, though fractured beyond functional use, exhibited curious properties during certain astronomical alignments. On the vernal equinox, Millicent observed with scientific precision how the damaged surface momentarily liquefied at precisely sunset, the fractures rearranging themselves into what appeared to be a map, not of terrestrial geography, but of celestial configurations unknown to contemporary astronomy. The phenomenon lasted precisely 73 seconds before resolidifying, leaving Millicent to wonder whether the custodian's banishment had truly been complete. Correspondence arrived from universities in Europe requesting information about unusual optical phenomena reported in Carolina. These letters, bearing the crests of institutions never before interested in rural American happenings, contained inquiries phrased with such specific knowledge that Millicent recognized them as probing for weaknesses. New vessels seeking entry points for the patient, eternal entities. Most disturbing were the dreams that visited not just Constance Thornfield, but all who had witnessed the confrontation in the square. These nocturnal visitations featured identical elements. A circular chamber whose walls consisted entirely of mirrors, each reflecting not the dreamer but a white-haired figure writing frantically in a journal bound in unfamiliar leather. The figure never acknowledged the dreamers, yet somehow conveyed urgent warnings through the very act of documentation. The mercury that had escaped Blackwell's shattered apparatus was never recovered. Periodic reports emerged of quicksilver droplets found moving against gravity in abandoned wells or collecting in perfect circles within the hollows of ancient trees. Each manifestation coincided with astronomical events described in the hieroglyphics adorning the protective mirrors backing solstices, eclipses, and planetary alignments whose significance remained obscured by time and translation difficulties. Throughout these unsettling developments, Millicent maintained Phidias records, creating a comprehensive archive that she sealed within a copper chest commissioned from a craftsman who had never laid eyes upon a Winchester mirror. The metal sourced from a mine untouched by Winchester investments possessed unusual properties, developing a patina that changed color according to the lunar cycle while remaining impervious to Mercury's corrupting influence. The symmetry remains incomplete. Constance Thornfield whispered during a particularly severe fever that coincided with a partial solar eclipse. The 44th vessel awaits across time rather than space. This cryptic pronouncement delivered in a voice that oscillated between her natural timbre and something ancient and hollow suggested that the confrontation in Craravans Mill represented merely one skirmish in a conflict spanning beyond conventional temporal boundaries. The implications proved most disturbing that the custodian's patient hunger might transcend not merely physical limitations but chronological ones as well, allowing them to seek vessels in epochs yet unrealized. Thus, the protective measures undertaken in 1889 might require perpetual vigilance, extending into futures beyond imagination, a burden of awareness passing from generation to generation. Through journals, mirrors, and the silver-streaked hair of those who had glimpsed beyond the veil of ordinary perception. The copper chest containing Millicent's meticulous records remained sealed for nearly 6 decades. Its peculiar patina deepening with each passing year until it acquired an almost sentient luster. When finally opened in the autumn of 1948 by her granddaughter Eleanor Davis, the papers within remained pristine, untouched by time's decay, the ink maintaining its original clarity as though the words had been transcribed mere days rather than decades prior. Eleanor, a spinster librarian with Millicent's analytical mind and the same distinctive streak of silver threading through otherwise chestnut hair, had inherited both the chest and the protective mirror following her grandmother's passing. The mirror's fractures had stabilized into what resembled a perfect map of the night sky, though the constellations depicted corresponded to no astronomical charts in existence. What Eleanor discovered within the chest extended far beyond mere documentation of the Craven's Mill incident. Her grandmother, it seemed, had developed a comprehensive theory regarding the custodian's nature, not as entities from beyond, but rather as parasitic consciousness that had evolved alongside humanity, feeding upon emotional experiences they themselves could not generate. The final journal entry penned in Millicent's tremulous hand shortly before her death contained a hypothesis most disquing that the protection afforded by the ancient Egyptian mirror had not banished the custodians but merely redirected their hunger through time itself. They feed not merely across space but through temporal dimensions. Millicent had written, the 44th vessel was never a mirror at all, but rather the collective consciousness of observers yet unborn, witnessing through the fractured lens of historical documentation. The implications proved staggering, that in documenting the Winchester mirrors and Blackwell's attempted continuation, Millicent had inadvertently created the very conduit through which the custodians might eventually return. Knowledge itself became the vessel, passing from generation to generation. Through written accounts that preserved not merely facts, but emotional resonance. Eleanor observed with scientific detachment how the protective mirror's fracture pattern subtly shifted when exposed to her grandmother's journals, as though responding to the narratives contained within. Most fascinating was its reaction to photographs, a technology that had advanced considerably since the days of Blackwell's apparatus. When ordinary photographs were placed before the mirror, no unusual effects manifested. However, when Eleanor experimented with self-portraits, the mirror's surface momentarily liquefied before reflecting not her features, but those of individuals unknown to her, faces expressing profound recognition. The village of Craven's Mill had long since evolved into a modest township, memory of the Winchester family, and Professor Blackwell's midnight blue wagon faded into local folklore. Only the curious botanical patterns persisted, visible now from newly constructed water towers and the bell tower of the rebuilt parish church. These concentric circles had developed additional complexity over the decades, forming what botanists classified as inexplicable microclimate variations. But Eleanor recognized as deliberate communication. The landscape itself preserving warnings that conventional documentation could not adequately contain. Each vernal equinox, Eleanor continued her grandmother's practice of observing the protective mirror at precisely sunset. The 73 seconds of liquefaction had neither shortened nor lengthened across the decades, suggesting a mathematical precision to the custodian's patient waiting that transcended conventional temporal understanding. The celestial map revealed during these brief windows had gradually shifted, its configuration approaching alignment with actual star positions visible in the Carolina night sky. As the seasons wheeled through their appointed cycles, Millicent Davis discovered among her grandmother's effects a previously overlooked document, a thin sheath of correspondence between Millicent and an unnamed academic whose letterhead bore only a curious symbol, a triangle bisected by wavering lines that resembled both water and flame. The letters, dated from the summer of 1892, revealed a dimension of the Winchester affair that had remained hidden even within the meticulously maintained copper chest. Your observations regarding the reflective properties of captured consciousness align with certain theoretical principles I have documented in my studies of non-Euclidean mathematics. The unnamed correspondent had written in a hand both precise and tremulous. The custodians, as you term them, represent not entities, but rather intersections, points where our reality's flat surface folds upon itself, creating reflections that appear to possess consciousness, but are merely our own universe, gazing back at itself through the dimensional divide. Most significant was the enclosed diagram illustrating what the writer termed the mathematics of recursive reflection, showing how consciousness, when trapped within perfectly aligned reflective surfaces, created not copies, but entirely new energy forms that existed independently of their sources. The Winchesters had not captured souls. They had inadvertently created entirely new consciousnesses born from the forced recursion of their victims' final moments of terror. The horror lies not in imprisonment but in birth. The correspondent continued, each mirror generated not a prison but a cradle for something that should never have existed. Consciousness without origin, experience without growth, being without becoming. Millicent traced the peculiar equations surrounding the diagram, noting how they corresponded with the fracture patterns in the protective mirror. The mathematical proof suggested that the protective mirror had not merely reflected the custodians back upon themselves, but had broken the recursion loop that sustained their existence, not destroying them, but rather revealing their fundamental emptiness. Most disturbing was the correspondent's final prediction. The pattern will reassert itself when technology permits mass reproduction of reflective surfaces capable of capturing not merely light, but emotional resonance. I calculate this convergence shall manifest approximately 1 century hence, when such devices become household commonplaces rather than rarities. Upon this prophetic notation, Eleanor gazed toward her sitting room where a newly acquired television set sat dark and silent, its screen perfectly reflective when not illuminated. Around the region, such devices were becoming increasingly common, each one presenting a perfect recursion chamber when switched off. Millions of surfaces designed specifically to capture emotional response and reflect it back upon viewers. The winter light filtering through her study window cast prismatic patterns across the protective mirror's fractured surface. For the first time in the 73-second liquefaction period that occurred at sunset, Eleanor observed a new phenomenon. The mirror reflecting not unknown faces but her own, precisely as she appeared, yet with eyes that tracked independently of her movements, examining her with the patient hunger of something that had finally found its appointed vessel after decades of waiting. The legacy of the Winchester family and their horrifying reflective vessels lingered in Craven's mill for generations, manifesting in subtle yet unmistakable alterations to both landscape and inhabitants. Children born within the township limits universally developed an aversion to mirrors before their 3rd birthday. Not a learned behavior, but something innate, as though encoded in the very genetic memory of the region. Pediatricians documented cases of infants turning their faces away from reflective surfaces with such violence that special accommodations became standard practice. In the local medical facilities, the botanical anomalies first observed after the custodian's banishment evolved into a living historical record that defied scientific explanation. Arborists from prestigious universities documented how Trees within the pattern's boundaries exhibited growth rings that formed not concentric circles but precise hieroglyphic symbols. The same Egyptian markings found on the protective mirror's silver backing. When cross-sections were photographed, the images invariably developed inexplicable light artifacts, regardless of the technology employed. Most remarkable was the phenomenon that came to be known as the Winchester reflective anomaly. Documented extensively in obscure academic journals, but never achieving mainstream scientific recognition. Throughout Craven's Mill and surrounding areas extending precisely 43 miles in each cardinal direction. Reflections occasionally displayed a 7-second delay, as though light itself hesitated before returning from mirrored surfaces. This temporal distortion manifested with mathematical precision, occurring only during astronomical alignments that corresponded with the positions originally documented in Millicent Davis's journals. The Winchester estate itself remained the epicenter of these disturbances. Despite multiple attempts at redevelopment, no structure erected upon the original foundation survived longer than 4 years and 43 days before succumbing to inexplicable structural failures. The county eventually designated the land as a nature preserve following the fifth such collapse. Though local guides refused to lead visitors through its overgrown paths after dusk when shadows reportedly moved independently of their sources and whispers emanated from the choked remains of the ornamental reflecting pool. Perhaps most profound were the psychological alterations observed in families descended from those who had witnessed the confrontation in the town square. These individuals possessed an uncanny ability to perceive deception as though permanently attuned to discrepancies between appearance and reality. Many pursued careers in jurisprudence, scientific research, or investigative journalism, professions requiring discernment between truth and fabrication. Their success rates in these fields defied statistical probability, leading to subtle discrimination from colleagues unable to comprehend their intuitive grasp of hidden matters. The protective mirror passed through successive generations, its fractured surface neither deteriorating further nor returning to its original integrity. Each inheritor reported identical dreams on the night of receiving their ancestral burden. Visions of standing before 43 doors arranged in a perfect circle. Each threshold presenting a different era, but all opening onto the same scene. A family gathered around a dinner table. Their faces perfectly ordinary until they turned toward mirrors hanging on every wall, revealing reflections that belonged to entirely different people. The ultimate truth of the Winchester mirrors came not through academic study nor supernatural revelation, but through a most ordinary discovery. In the autumn of 2015, during renovation of the Craven's Mill Historical Society building, formerly the parish church where Millicent had sought sanctuary, workers uncovered a sealed lead box within the cornerstone. Inside lay a final confession from Augustus Winchester himself, written on parchment preserved by the airtight container. The yellow document, its ink rich and dark, as though penned yesterday, revealed what neither Millicent nor her descendants had fully comprehended. The Winchesters had not been mere human collaborators with ancient entities. They themselves had been early imperfect vessels, reflections given form through generations of careful breeding. Augustus's great-grandfather, an Egyptian expedition member in the late 1700s, had discovered the first mirror in a previously undocumented chamber beneath the Sphinx. Upon gazing into it, he became the initial receptor for the custodian's infiltration, a process that evolved through subsequent generations until the Winchester family existed as perfect human facsimiles, their internal emptiness concealed behind precisely calculated expressions and immaculate mannerisms. We were never truly alive, Augustus had written in script that changed subtly across each line, as though multiple hands guided the quill. What gazed from our eyes was ancient before your species learned to speak. The mirrors did not trap souls. They were windows through which we observed potential vessels. Each reflection captured was an evaluation, a measuring of worthiness for occupation. Most disturbing was his final revelation concerning the protective mirror that had saved Millicent and later generations. Its Egyptian creator had fashioned it not as protection against the custodians, but as their ultimate vessel, designed to collect and concentrate their consciousness until sufficient technology evolved to facilitate their complete manifestation. The fractures Millicent observed were not signs of the mirror's destruction, but rather its metamorphosis, each pattern corresponding to stages in what Augustus termed the Great Unfolding. The 44th vessel is not a mirror nor a person, his confession concluded. It is the collective unconscious of humanity itself, accessed through mass-reduced reflective technologies developing simultaneously across your civilization. When every human gazes upon themselves and sees not truth but curated illusion, when the recursive loop of received reality replaces authentic experience, our waiting ends. The document bore as final signature not Augustus's name but a symbol identical to the one burned into the cobblestones of Craven's Mill Square. The same configuration formed by the botanical anomalies. The same pattern found in the fractures of the protective mirror. And most chillingly, the same design now embedded within the circuit architecture of every digital device capable of reflecting its user's image back upon them. The box contained one additional item, a small disc of polished obsidian, utterly unremarkable, save for its perfect circumference, and the strange property that viewing it never revealed one's own reflection, but always a face belonging to someone else. Someone gazing back with expressions of desperate warning that arrived exactly 7 seconds too late. The obsidian disc passed from hand to hand through generations of Davis descendants, its unusual properties neither diminishing nor intensifying across the decades. Scholars who examined it detected microscopic engravings visible only under electron microscopes developed in the late 20th century. Mathematical equations describing the precise curvature necessary for reflective surfaces to breach dimensional boundaries. Their complexity suggested knowledge centuries beyond what should have been possible when the disk was created. By the autumn of 2022, the protective mirror's fracture patterns had completed their slow metamorphosis, forming a perfect geometric configuration that precisely matched the circuitry of contemporary digital devices. Eleanor's great granddaughter, Margaret Davis Chen, professor of theoretical physics at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, conducted the first comprehensive spectrographic analysis of both artifacts. Her findings, published in an obscure journal with limited circulation, documented how the mirror's surface emitted radiation at frequencies identical to those utilized by global telecommunications networks. Most alarming was Margaret's discovery that these emissions increased exponentially during video conference calls when millions worldwide gazed at digital reflections of themselves slightly altered by camera angles and processing algorithms. Each such interaction generated minute energy signatures that, when mapped globally, formed the same symbol burned into Craven's Mill Square nearly 133 years earlier. The protective mirror now hung in Margaret's Cambridge office, its fractured surface monitored by sensitive equipment that recorded its subtle transformations. During the spring equinox of 2023, the 73 seconds of liquefaction extended to 74 for the first time since Millicent's original observations. The additional second corresponded precisely with an unprecedented global telecommunications event when 3.7 billion individuals simultaneously engaged with reflective digital interfaces during a worldwide broadcast. Through Margaret's instruments, the ancient battle between human perception and the patient eternal custodians acquired quantifiable dimensions. The mathematical probability of random coincidence had long since been eliminated by the sheer precision of these correlations. What remained was the inescapable conclusion first intimated in Augustus Winchester's confession that humanity's evolving relationship with its own reflected image represented not technological progress but the final stage of an infiltration millennia in preparation. The original Winchester estate still ostensibly protected as a nature Preserve manifested new anomalies. Motion-activated wildlife cameras installed by environmental researchers captured footage of perfectly ordinary forest scenes that, when played back, showed entirely different images, groups of formally dressed individuals gathering before mirrors, their reflections consistently showing different people than those standing before them. The time stamp on these recordings always displayed the same 7-second delay observed throughout the region since the 1889 incident. As Margaret compiled her findings into the copper chest inherited alongside the other artifacts, she recognized the terrible symmetry approaching completion. The 44th vessel had never been a single mirror or person, but rather the collective consciousness of humanity itself, gradually conditioned to accept reflections that bore increasingly tenuous connections to reality. The custodian's patient strategy executed across centuries had created a world where every human gazed constantly into versions of themselves curated by algorithms and technologies they barely comprehended. Perfect conditions for the great unfolding Augustus Winchester had prophesied in the quiet archives of Cambridge University. As winter solstice approached in 2023, Margaret Davis Chen made her final entry in the family records. Outside her window, snow fell with mathematical precision, each crystalline flake spiraling in patterns that mimicked the fractures of the protective mirror hanging on her office wall. The mirror now pulsed with subtle luminescence that her instruments could measure but could not explain, a resonance that harmonized perfectly with the electromagnetic frequencies of global communications networks. On her desk lay the obsidian disk surrounded by printouts of worldwide telecommunications data. The patterns were unmistakable. During moments when humanity's attention focused on their own digitally reflected images, microscopic alterations occurred in the collective consciousness. Subtle shifts in perception too gradual for any individual to notice, yet profound in their cumulative effect. The threshold approaches, she wrote in the leather-bound journal, her handwriting a perfect fusion of her own academic precision and the elegant script of ancestors dating back to Millicent. When 3.7 billion souls simultaneously accept their digitally altered reflections as reality, the 44th vessel achieves completion. The snow-muffled Cambridge evening settled around her office like a funeral shroud. Through her window, she observed how pedestrians moved with uncanny synchronicity, their attention fixed upon handheld screens, reflecting not merely their faces, but carefully curated versions of themselves. Algorithms subtly adjusting features, smoothing imperfections, creating reflections designed for maximum psychological acceptance. The protective mirror emitted an audible sigh. That same sound of capitulation Millicent had documented in Helena Winchester's chambers 134 years prior. Its fracture pattern shifted one final time, forming a perfect circuit that matched the global telecommunications network in miniature. Margaret understood with terrible clarity what none of her ancestors could have comprehended. That the Winchesters had merely been forerunners, their crude mirrors representing primitive prototypes for the ultimate vessel. Modern humanity had willingly created the perfect conditions for the custodian's manifestation. Billions of souls gazing not at reality, but at reflections algorithmically designed to capture and reshape consciousness itself. As the clock struck midnight, Margaret completed her documentation and sealed the copper chest for whatever generation might follow. The final entry contained precise mathematical formulas describing how to recognize the subtle differences between genuine human consciousness and the custodian influence, calculations that might serve as a new protective mirror for an age when traditional reflective surfaces had become obsolete. Outside her window, the snow ceased falling. In its place, millions of tiny motes of light descended, not precipitation, but something resembling the liquefaction of reality itself. Throughout Cambridge, pedestrians paused in perfect unison, their expressions momentarily vacant before being replaced with minute Adjustments to posture, subtle alterations to facial symmetry, imperceptible refinements to vocal patterns. The protective mirror shattered into precisely 44 fragments, each containing not a portion of reflection, but a complete face. Different individuals spanning centuries, unified in expressions of mute warning. The obsidian disc remained intact, now reflecting Margaret's face perfectly for the first time since its creation. She placed the disc atop her completed records, her fingers lingering upon its cool surface. The reflection gazed back with eyes that contained not terror but profound acceptance. The gaze of one who comprehends that some boundaries once crossed permit no return journey. This has been the Ghastly Journal. Until next time, remember that some stories are best left untold.